Day 37. St. John to Dieppe. I woke to the sounds of someone behind me revving their engine several times, as if it were an alarm clock to wake me up. I took notice and gathered myself together as I would depart for a much nicer natural environment. Being across from Reversing Falls meant I didn't sleep very well the night prior. Under advice from the lovely couple I met the day earlier, who were originally from Vancouver, I stopped by a local CAA office and obtained travel guides for Atlantic Canada. These would be incredibly useful for the remainder of my time exploring the rest of Atlantic provinces. I hastily left St. John, and unlike the cities prior, I had no feeling of sadness departing for a new adventure. I drove eastward to St. Martin's, another area in New Brunswick that I had never been to before. From here, I would explore the St. Martin Sea Caves. It was great to be right by the water, in a beautiful natural environment. Not since the Gaspe Peninsula a few days ago have I been so close to the water in such a beautiful setting. It was sunny out, quite warm actually, but the breeze again had a cooling effect that made things bearable. Thankfully, it wasn't humid like the weeks I spent in Toronto to Quebec City. Again, I found myself amongst groups of people, and I was surprised by how busy it was there. While most travelers attempt to avoid groups of tourists, for myself, I found it great just to see people trying to live a normal life and enjoy themselves throughout the restrictions. The tide was out, which was perfect as it allowed me to wander through the beach and walk right up to the sea caves. Unfortunately, this would require traversing through the water. At first, I attempted to look for a path with shallow water that I could hop across in order to stay dry. But then I decided this was the first time in decades, literally, since I have been back in New Brunswick, and for the first time back in the Bay of Fundy. Therefore, to hell with it. I would walk across the water. I wandered through some shallow water without any consideration of removing my shoes and socks and simply enjoyed the moment. I actually did this a few times just to immerse myself with the lovely feeling of being back home by the ocean. I wandered over to several of the sea caves and peered over to the cliffs above them. I knew nothing of geology, but I could imagine how many millennia it would have taken for these sea caves to form. I watched as families of young children would peer into the sea caves to see what secrets lie within them, and I myself wandered right up close to them as well. Naturally, it was forbidden to enter them for safety concerns, but it was interesting to look into them up close. Some were quite shallow, but some seemingly were an abyss leading to depths unknown. I can imagine that in the evening, young punk-ass kids would come by and create havoc in these sea caves, but surprisingly, they were pristine. Perhaps that type of behavior would be much less common in Atlantic Canada than on the West Coast. After enjoying my time here, I headed back to my beast, switched over to some dry socks and my hiking boots, and drove over to the Fundy Trail Parkway. The Fundy Trail Parkway was recently created to boost tourism in New Brunswick, and rightfully so, as the southern shore of New Brunswick, facing the Bay of Fundy, was an absolutely spectacular area. Aside from the industrial city of St. John, of course, the Fundy Trail Parkway was a stretch of road that housed numerous lookout points and included beach access and even a UNESCO Biosphere area. I arrived at the western entrance where I was greeted by an attendant whom I spoke to for some time. It turned out that she lived on Vancouver Island the summer before, visiting her sister, and she loved being on the west coast. She and I laughed about the differences between living on the west coast and east coast, and while she mentioned she never lived in the Prairies, I told her she wasn't missing out on anything, unless she lived in Edmonton or Calgary, and the provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba were pointless. After our colorful conversation, I bid her farewell and continued further into the Fundy Trail Parkway. My first stop was the Flowerpot Rock area. There were so many lookout points I would be driving for only 5 minutes and then stopping if I wanted to take more pictures. So I decided that I would only target very specific lookout points with beach access. I parked at the Fox Rock Lookout where I peered into the beautiful Bay of Fundy. From there, I descended a set of steps and down a path of the Flowerpot Rock trail that led to Melvin Beach. I was able to see the iconic Flowerpot Rock, the famous sea stack that is one of the most photographed areas of the Fundy Trail Parkway. I continued descending down until I reached Melvin Beach. Along the way, I thought of how it was a great idea to switch to hiking boots as some of the trail became surprisingly muddy. Eventually, I reached Melvin Beach where I found a group of school children with a guide enjoying the deserted beach. In order for me to venture further down the beach, though, it required hiking up a relatively high sandbank. I noticed that the children and the tour guide were curiously staring at me as if I was someone they would not have seen on a regular basis. Here I was, shirtless, with a red cowboy hat, just like I was when I was walking around Montreal and Toronto, exploring the area. I ran up this high sandbank, and with each step I found myself nearly clambering to gain more elevation. My feet would sink under the sand, and it became more challenging to get to the top. But when I reached the top, I felt a sense of accomplishment. The children and the guide cheered in the distance as I waved to them with joy. From there, I walked along the beach again, allowing myself to get wet with the cold but refreshing water of the Bay of Fundy. I looked over and I thought about how strange it was to have the beach all to myself, and it reminded me of how the restrictions have prevented people from enjoying their lives. Again, I felt tremendous gratitude for being able to do what I was doing, traveling across the country and now doing things that many people were not able to do. I wandered throughout the beach, just reminiscing on my childhood in New Brunswick and enjoying the blissful moment of being back in nature. With no one around me, the only sounds were that of the environment. It was strange to be on a beach well over 2 kilometers long with no other people around in the midst of a beautiful summer day. I wandered over to a nearby sea cave, and although there was no safety risk, I did feel a little precarious about it collapsing on me. Perhaps my lack of experience exploring sea caves left me with a heightened sense of danger, but I explored nevertheless. I had found that it had been frequented previously. Thankfully, nothing that was left there was too vulgar or obscene, and I'm sure that the force of nature would remove anything left behind in short time. I could have continued further down the beach, but that would have required wading into waist-deep water, and I wasn't familiar with tidal studies, so I hiked back up to my beast. A short drive later, I found myself at Fuller Falls, a small but fast-flowing waterfall within the Fundy Trail Parkway. A very steep set of wooden stairs led down to the waterfall. There was nothing too spectacular about the waterfall itself. It was beautiful, but obviously nothing compared to Niagara Falls or Mont Morency, which I visited previously. It was a nice adventure just getting down to the waterfall using the steep and narrow wooden stairs. Thankfully, they had a cable handrail for assistance, as I'm certain this would normally have been quite dangerous without something to hold on to. Some people ventured almost right towards the waterfall. I chose not to, as I did not want to slip and fall on my ass in front of everyone. I did manage to dip my hand in the fast-moving water, however. I didn't spend too much time here. I headed back up to my beast and drove further until I reached the Fundy Trail Parkway Interpretive Center. From here, I discovered a little history of the Fundy Trail Parkway, and although there was a museum, gift shop, and small eatery, I chose to explore the campground. In the midst of the late summer, the water flow was low, but I could imagine that it would have been much higher during the spring. There was a suspension bridge crossing the Big Salmon River, and naturally I felt inclined to walk over it. Despite the Fundy Trail Parkway being over 20 years old, everything was very well maintained well kept and well established. New Brunswick had a lot of potential for tourism if it had further invested in its natural beauty. After enjoying my wonderful experience seeing the sea caves, waterfalls, and crossing a suspension bridge, I left the Fundy Trail Parkway for another, more famous area in New Brunswick. Most likely the most iconic and most famous area of New Brunswick was the Hopewell Rocks. On my way to the Hopewell Rocks, I stopped by a cliff to take one last picture of the beauty surrounding southern New Brunswick. It was truly great to be back in this province. I returned to my beast, fired her up, and off I went. After a short drive, I arrived at the Hopewell Rocks. Amazingly, I arrived in time to be able to walk the ocean floor. After finding a place to park, I wandered through a maze of cordoned off areas to locate the steps leading down to the Hopewell Rocks. Since the restrictions were very high and Atlantic Canada just recently opened up to the rest of the country, there were many areas that had restricted access. The visitor center was mainly closed with the exception of guided tours, but I was able to find a legend that would lead me down to the steps. I was able to explore several observation platforms before finding the right path that led me down to the steps. From these observation platforms, I could look out into the seemingly endless Bay of Fundy. After a brief hike, I reached the steps where I could see the majestic Hopewell Rocks. I remember coming here as a child, my family being awestruck by these sea stacks and only imagining how they could have been created over such a long period of time. I slowly descended down the platform leading to the ocean floor, looking at this Canadian landmark that is the icon of New Brunswick. When I finally reached the bottom, I had to touch the soft, muddy ocean floor. It felt like I was back home. There was something about being by the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean in particular, that was different from being back in Victoria on the west coast. The tide was slowly rising, but there was still time to enjoy the experience. Created over endless tides of erosion, the world-famous sea stacks were now in front of me, again leaving me in awe. Unsurprisingly, it was quite busy with many visitors. There were barriers to prevent people from coming too close to the bottom of the cliffs, as there was a possibility of rockfall. Some people took it upon themselves to create inuksuks out of the fallen rocks. There was a kayaking group who came around the rocks to enjoy the scenery from the water. I knew that when I returned here one day, I would definitely take up that opportunity as well. Small sea caves could be seen at the bottom of the cliffs, and I could imagine hooligans sneaking here at night to have a campfire in these sea caves. I stood behind some of the sea stacks and then looked up just to see how massive they really were. Many of these sea stacks had vegetation on them as well. It would be cool to return at high tide and actually see if clambering up these sea stacks was a possibility, although I was certain that would be greatly prohibited. I came across several children that were laughing and pointing at something, and I wandered over to see what caught their attention. A small crab was on its back, trying to fix itself upright so it could move away. I didn't want to disturb the course of nature, so I let it be. I didn't spend too much time at the Hopewell Rocks as the tide was returning, so I smiled at the rocks and made my way back to my beast. When I reached the top of the flat platform, I looked back to remember coming here as a child. I also knew that this would not be my last time visiting, and again I would return to this wonderful place that I held in my memories for so long. When I reached the top of the platform, I looked back to remember coming here as a child. I also knew that this would not be my last time visiting. And again, I would return to this wonderful place that I held in my memories for so long. But for now, it was time to retire, as tomorrow would be another incredible adventure into the unknown. Thank you for sharing in my experience. If you enjoyed my video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would truly appreciate you sharing my video on your social network, as it helps my channel grow. Be sure to check my playlist to see different categories on my exciting adventures I'm sharing with the world. Life is an adventure. Let's share this experience together.